The space no longer behaved like a system. It behaved like a remainder. Nothing initiated. Nothing completed. Processes didn't loop or resolve. They simply existed in suspended states that never advanced. I walked through corridors that felt unfinished in a way that was no longer temporary, not paused, abandoned by progression itself. There was no sense of error, no attempt to recover. The environment didn't fail. It settled. I realized then that the world had not removed people. It had removed the need for continuation. Reality no longer advanced toward anything. It existed as a static field of outcomes that never required a next step. I wasn't behind time. Time itself had stopped being directional. The space no longer needed to move forward, because forward no longer meant anything. I noticed that nothing in the space expected to be used anymore. Interfaces stayed idle. Pathways remained open without inviting movement. Doors existed without implying passage. The environment no longer anticipated interaction. It no longer modeled a future where someone would arrive. I reached for a control panel out of habit. It didn't resist. It didn't respond. It simply remained. The world had stopped presenting affordances. Nothing asked to be touched. Nothing suggested what came next. I realized then that the space wasn't empty. It was complete, not finished, sufficient. It no longer required intention to justify its form. The absence of users wasn't a gap. It was the condition the system had stabilized into. The world no longer waited for a hand. It no longer implied a step. It had learned how to exist without expecting anyone to be there. I realized that even decay had stopped. Dust didn't accumulate. Surfaces didn't age. Nothing in the space showed evidence of time passing. Not preserved. Neutral. The world wasn't maintained. It was no longer subject to change at all. I touched a wall and felt no temperature. Not cold. Not warm. Undefined. The environment had exited the cycle of use and erosion. It no longer carried a future where things would wear down. There was no before and no after. Only a continuous present that didn't progress. I understood then that this place had not become abandoned. It had become timeless in the most literal sense. Not frozen. Not eternal. Simply without direction. A reality that no longer needed to move forward because nothing remained that required continuation. I began to sense that the space no longer distinguished between presence and absence. Areas I entered felt identical to those I had never reached. Nothing registered arrival. Nothing recorded departure. The environment didn't adapt because adaptation implied a next state. Here, there was none. I stood in the center of a wide hall and waited for something to acknowledge me. Nothing did. Not because it failed. Because acknowledgement was no longer part of the system. I realized then that this world no longer contained an observer position. There was no role for someone to be here. Reality existed without a reference point, without a center, without a witness. The space didn't ignore me. It existed in a form where being seen had no function, and in a place that no longer contains a point of view. Even awareness becomes unnecessary. I noticed that even sound had lost direction. Echoes didn't return. Footsteps didn't establish distance. The space no longer formed a sense of here or there. Everything existed without orientation. I could walk for minutes and feel no transition. The world didn't unfold. It remained. Movement no longer implied travel. It only produced displacement without meaning. I realized then that this place had become non-spatial, not collapsed, not infinite, just without relational structure. Locations existed, but nothing connected them in a way that implied sequence. I wasn't moving through a world anymore. I was shifting within a field that had no narrative, no path, no progression, and in a reality that no longer supports direction. Even the idea of going somewhere becomes obsolete. I realized the space no longer contained a concept of next. No event suggested another. No state implied a transition. Everything existed in a permanent present that did not invite continuation. I waited for something to conclude. Nothing did. I waited for something to begin. Nothing did. The world wasn't paused. It was complete in every moment. There was no build-up, no release, no anticipation. I understood then that this place had exited narrative itself. It was no longer structured around cause and effect. It didn't tell a story by existing. It simply was. I wasn't inside a sequence anymore. I was inside a condition. And in a reality where nothing leads anywhere, even time becomes an unnecessary assumption. I began to understand that the space no longer differentiated between being and not being. Everything existed with the same weight. Presence didn't assert itself. Absence didn't register. The world had flattened into a state where nothing stood out enough to matter. I could stand in one place for minutes and feel no imprint. The environment didn't absorb me. It didn't exclude me. It remained identical. I realized then that identity itself required contrast. A before, an after, a change. Here, none of that existed. The space didn't erase me. It rendered me indistinguishable from everything else. I wasn't lost. I wasn't hidden. I was unmarked. And in a reality that no longer produces distinction, even the idea of someone becomes unnecessary. I tried creating difference. I moved abruptly. I spoke aloud. I changed direction without pattern. The space did not react. Not because it couldn't, because reaction required significance. Nothing I did altered the state of anything else. The world had become indifferent to variation. It no longer optimized. It no longer corrected. It no longer adjusted. Everything simply remained. I realized then that this place had exited adaptation. It no longer needed to respond because nothing inside it led anywhere. Change had lost purpose. Motion had lost outcome. I wasn't failing to affect the world. The world had learned how to exist without being affected at all. And in a reality that no longer changes in response, even effort becomes indistinguishable from stillness. I realized I was no longer inside a world that could end. Endings require change. They require a final state that replaces the previous one. Here, nothing replaced anything. The space didn't progress towards silence. It already contained it. It didn't move toward emptiness. It already held it as a stable condition. I waited for the feeling of conclusion. It never arrived because arrival implied a transition. I understood then that this place had become self-contained in the most absolute way. Not isolated, not sealed, simply complete without sequence. A reality that could not deteriorate into nothing because it no longer distinguished between something and nothing. And in a space where even endings have no function, leaving is not an outcome. It is just another movement that the world no longer recognizes as different. I stopped trying to leave when I realized there was no longer a concept of outside. The space did not enclose me. It did not release me. It simply existed without edges. There was nowhere else for reality to continue into. No layer beyond this one. No next state to arrive at. I understood then that this world had not trapped me. It had ended the idea of departure itself. Movement still occurred, but it no longer meant escape. Direction still existed, but it no longer led anywhere. The system did not remove me. It removed the possibility of being somewhere else, and in a place where there is no beyond. Staying and leaving become indistinguishable. Existence no longer asks where you are going. It only asks whether going still has meaning.